Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this webinar/meeting that the Disarm End Wars Issue Committee of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom US section has arranged. And we know that over 60 people have registered for this event. So we will be delaying for a couple more minutes as we watch people come in. We're up to 15 participants now. Our speaker will give us plenty of time to ask questions after his presentation. And because it's only a meeting and not a webinar, you will actually be able to hold up your hand, as you all know how to do that. Raise your hand electronically and ask your question in person. You will not have to depend on the Q&A or anything like that, and the chat will also, we can make the chat will be working, although it's not so nice to be chatting away in the chat while your honored guest is speaking. So we'd rather you delayed putting things in the chat until the professor has finished. So those of you who are not familiar with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, I'll just point out that we were founded in 1915, which means this year, in 2025, we're 110 years old. And all that time we have been working, our predecessors obviously, we've been working to try to stop wars from ever starting. We've been trying to get the diplomatic solutions used, diplomatic strategies rather than actually going fighting. And we've been trying to get the countries of the world to disarm, especially from nuclear weapons, which are, of course, the most atrocious type of weapon in their destructive power. And they, of course, are indiscriminate because they destroy such a large area. They kill civilians as well as military people. In war, the rules of war say you're only supposed to kill your military personnel. You're not supposed to kill civilians. So nuclear weapons, per force, kill anybody within a few miles of them. And so this is one of the activities that the Disarm Issue Committee, of which I am a chair. I'm Cheryl Spencer, by the way. My two co-chairs are here, Ellen Thomas and Diane Blay. We have so much to do that we have three co-chairs of our committee. And I see it's now 5 after 5 here in where I am, Palo Alto, California. And we're up to 18 participants. So, Diane, do you think that's sufficient? Shall we get going now?
I think we should get going, and then we have the recording so people can listen. We'll have the recording so
right.
Yeah.
So I'm now going to turn it over to Gloria McMillan, who is a member of our Disarm End Wars Issue Committee, and she will do the honors of introducing our esteemed speaker today. Thank you, Gloria. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much to my esteemed co-chairs and especially to Cheryl, who did this great introduction to the Disarm Committee, and to WILPF, and also the dangers we face. It is my honor, and I am so happy to be able to introduce Dr. Pascal Lottaz. He is an associate professor at Kyoto University, where he investigates neutrality in international relations and directs the research network, neutralitystudies.com. He received his PhD from the National Graduate Institute for Policy Studies, or GRIPS, or GRIPS, in Japan, and previously taught at Waseda University and Temple University, Japan campus. His recent books include Sweden, Japan, and the Long Second World War, 2022, Routledge, Neutral Beyond the Cold, Neutral States and the Post-Cold War International System, 2022, Notions of Neutralities, 2019. He also wrote articles on neutrality studies for the Oxford Encyclopedia, and you can find Pascal at YouTube, Neutrality Studies. And it is now my honor to turn it over to Pascal.
Well, thank you very much, Gloria, Diane, and Cheryl, for your kind words and the invitation, of course, to speak to you. I was actually not aware that your group has been around for 110 years. This is extremely impressive, and it shows again that peace movements have not only always been around, but that they are often formed in response to warfare. 1915 is, of course, you must have been formed right after the breakout of the First World War, and in this sense, peace movements and your organization is very response. Not often. I actually claim it's always a response or happens in connection with conflict. I will go into this topic in the second part of my presentation, because we said you're also interested in my assessments of NATO, so I will do that first, and then show as a counter example of how neutrality works and in what sense it can be a counter proposal to military alliances and security, the so-called collective security approach to international relations. Let me start with this one, and the plan is that we have at least 30-40 minutes for discussion, so I hope I will not be too long. When we discussed via email, you said, somebody of you I think saw a video that I made on NATO and why I brand NATO as a criminal organization. And I did that in my video, of course, also in order to be provocative. But I think not just under international law, NATO is breaching oftentimes what is still admissible in times of peace and times of war. But very importantly, NATO breaks its own treaty, its own foundational document. And I often tell my students in class, instead of reading a lot of articles and books about stuff, just go to the original treaties. Just reading a treaty or two, especially the important ones, will give you a lot of insights and aha moments when you read what's actually in these documents. One of the treaties to read is the United Nations Charter. Just download it and have a look over it. And another one can, of course, be the North Atlantic Treaty, signed in Washington, D.C. in April 1949. So this is also an old club and organization, just one with way more money than probably your organization or mine or anyone else, and of course way more firepower, unfortunately. But so I just want to read with you 3 articles of the North Atlantic Treaty, and then discuss what this means and in what ways and sense NATO today, the organization, is in breach of this. Because I must say, if NATO lived up to its treaty, if it was within the bounds of what it promises itself to be, I would be more than happy to have it around. I mean, read Article 1. It's a beautiful article. Article 1. The parties undertake, as set forth in the Charter of the United Nations, to settle any international dispute in which they may be involved by peaceful means, in such a manner that international peace and security and justice are not endangered, and to refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force in any manner inconsistent with the purpose of the United Nations. What this first article does is it establishes that NATO is its own organization, but it is, of course, subsumed to the UN, right? This is the recognition that NATO only operates within the parameters of the UN Charter. And that is fundamental, because the UN Charter, of course, already outlaws the use of force or the threat of the use of force, with which this article just once again confirms, right? This is a very pacifist type of article that means to say that NATO will not in any way, shape or form replace or go beyond the UN framework. So that's a first very important thing. And then this is the famous Article 5. I skipped the other ones because for our discussion they're not that relevant. So this is the mutual, mutual defense article, and I want to point out a couple of things, but let's read it first. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all. And consequently, they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, recognized by Article 51 of the UN Charter, will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking forthwith, individually and in concert with other parties, such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. I have a little bit of background noise here. I hope this is not disturbing you, but the important thing here is, again, Article 51 of the UN Charter is, as pointed out here, the one that says that if a UN member is attacked, it has the right to defend itself, and it has the right to receive help by others for collective self-defense. So the NATO Charter plugs into this UN article as well. What I especially want to point out is here already in Article 5, the area in which the NATO wants to do collective self-defense is Europe or North America, right? This is the Atlantic area that we then usually refer to, and it's repeated here again, right, in the North Atlantic area. So there's the scope of where this is valid. One more thing I want to point out, although it's a little bit beyond or besides the discussion we are having, is that often Article 5 is cited as the obligation of states to come to each other's help militarily. I just want to point out how this is phrased, right? That member states, NATO member states will consider an attack against one as an attack against all, and they will take such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, not exclusively with the use of armed force. Armed force is actually not a requirement for member states of NATO if another member is attacked. It can be, but it is not necessary. And this is quite interesting because it's often said that, if anyone attacks a NATO member, let's say anyone attacks Poland, then automatically the United States would be obliged to go to war with whoever attacked Poland. Well, that's just not true. The United States actually maintains all freedom of action to intervene in a way that it chooses appropriate. There is no automatic mechanism that says now everybody needs to send military personnel. Not at all. You don't even have to send military materials if you choose not to do so. So that's just to say, if anyone argues we have no choice, that's just not true. Even if a NATO member should be attacked, the United States would still have the choice to choose, political options, sanctions, whatever, in order to counter that. So this is just a myth, an absolute myth that the treaty establishes that you have to automatically help militarily. Just not true, because it's written very clearly here. The second part of Article 5 then reads that any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the Security Council. Such measures shall be terminated when the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to restore and maintain international peace and security. This again is an article that says, okay, even if we do collective self-defense, we will immediately stop doing so once the Security Council takes over from us, right? So the NATO is thoroughly subsumed under the UN Charter and especially under the authority of the Security Council. In 49, of course, it was already clear that the Security Council would be blocked quite a lot of times, especially in this great power competition between the US and the Soviet Union, which is the primary reason why NATO was formed, so that there would be some form of deterrent, collective defense, deterrent against the Soviet Union, although it must also be said that in 1949, the members of NATO were extremely weak. The only powerful one was the United States, but they were outmatched by just the sheer number of millions of Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. So in 49, this was more of a show of political force than really military force. In the meantime, this has, of course, completely changed. NATO is today a very powerful and very, in my view, also very dangerous organization that has shown several times that it can wreak havoc on places. But we will go into that in a moment, because there's a third article we need to look at, and that's article number 6. Because again, this article, you know, the people who made this NATO treaty were obviously aware that they need to put a couple of restrictions into the charter in order to make sure that the the organization remains what it is supposed to be, which is a defensive alliance. And this Article 6 here is quite important because it outlines the geographical area on which NATO is to operate. Article 6. For the purpose of Article 5, an armed attack on one or more of the parties is deemed to include an armed attack on the territory of any of the parties in Europe or North America, on the Algerian departments of France. This is also quite interesting because France at the time was still a colonial power, and Algeria was counted as part of the territory of France, of course. I mean, this just shows you that NATO also has an entire colonial legacy, right? So an attack against Algeria will count as an attack on Europe, on the territory of Turkey, or on the islands under the jurisdiction of any of the parties in the North Atlantic area, north of the Tropic of Cancer. If you wonder what the Tropic of Cancer is, the Tropic of Cancer is the line, the most northern line at which the sun still can shine in a 90-degree angle on Earth. So it's this latitude between which the sun, you know, goes up and down between summer and winter. It goes up and down. I mean, sorry, the Earth is tilted, and that's why the sun, like, you know, sometimes shines at a 90-degree angle and sometimes more or less. So this line down here, this is the Tropic of Cancer. So an attack against one of the members above this line is deemed an attack against one, and therefore would trigger Article 5. Or in the second part, on the forces, vessels, or aircrafts of any of the parties when in or over these territories or any other area in Europe in which occupation forces of any of the parties were stationed on the date when the treaty entered into force, or the Mediterranean Sea or the North Atlantic area north of the Tropic of Cancer. What this thing does is just it makes sure that if there's some attack on one of the on a vessel or on any kind of possession of one of the European or North American states below this line, that wouldn't count as an attack on NATO, right? This geographically confines the area of NATO of NATO area. Like even if somebody is attacked below here, or if a ship is attacked somewhere in the southern Atlantic or in the Pacific, if the United States was attacked in the Pacific, that would not count as a Article 5 attack on a NATO member, because not in this area, right? Not in the North Atlantic or area. Whether Hawaii is covered by NATO or not, I think we would have to assess this separately, and I'm pretty sure there's arguments for and against this. But in general, the treaty itself is pretty clear that it wants to confine the area of action to Europe and North America and the Atlantic in between them, right? And this is my entire argument why NATO is breaching its own treaty, when then in 1999 it clearly and utterly went beyond its scope of where it is supposed to act, right? In 1999, for the first time, NATO bombed, used force in a part that was not covered by the North Atlantic Treaty. It bombed Yugoslavia, the Federal Republic at the time, bombing Belgrade, and it did so for 3 months. Yugoslavia was not, and still is not. I mean, Serbia still is not to this day a member of NATO. There was no self-defense. I mean, there was no attack on a NATO member going on. So using force, or the threat of force, is by its own charter, Article 1, forbidden, and it still did so. It did so with the argumentation that this is a necessary use of force in order to protect the to bring about a change in the military policies of Serbia against the forces it was fighting in Kosovo, and with the argument that the NATO needs to prevent another Srebrenica from happening, the massacre that took place in 1995 in Bosnia-Herzegovina, and to protect it's a humanitarian intervention in order to protect the Albanians in Kosovo. And this resulted then in a 3-month bombing campaign in which NATO really set fire to a lot of places. And one of the first things NATO bombed was the electrical power grid of Serbia, of Belgrade. One of my Serbian friends, who was a child at the time, he told me with a lot of sarcasm, the best thing about the bombings in Serbia was that they took out the power stations, which meant our fridges and freezers were not working, which meant that people took out all of their frozen meat, and for 3 days straight had barbecues all over Belgrade because you needed to somehow use up the meat. But so much about not targeting civilian infrastructure. The picture down here on the left-hand side, by the way, if I'm not mistaken, the building here is actually the TV station, the national broadcaster, that was bombed at 2 a.m. in the early days of the bombing campaign, in which like several journalists and people who were working there died. So immediately this NATO started taking out the broadcasting infrastructure. This was a civilian broadcaster. NATO, of course, justified this by saying the civilian broadcaster is used for military purposes as well. And the British government argued that Milosevic was using it as a way to distribute Serbian propaganda, and that Milosevic would need to allocate equal time to distribute NATO viewpoints on these radio and TV waves in order for this to be a neutral facility. But since it is not, it is a legitimate target. So long story short, NATO went way beyond its mandate by starting bombing Serbia, and it also committed, in my view, very clearly war crimes by targeting civilian infrastructure. And here, sorry, I even have a little map, right, of the extent of NATO. This is all, the blue ones are all the NATO countries at the time. Serbia is the one down here, of course. So and Yugoslavia was in this process of it was going through a horrible civil war, which ended up in breaking the country into 7 successor states, of course, right? And the intervention of NATO was very much one of the things that that sealed the fate of the final republics inside Yugoslavia. And to me, it's just a clear breach of the NATO Charter itself. And ever since 1999, NATO has started calling these interventions abroad out of area missions. And the part of the rationale for this was, of course, to find a new reason for NATO to exist. At the time, in 1999, it was pretty clear, the slogan and the article headlines went around with the title "Out of Area or Out of Business." Because, of course, with the end of the Cold War, NATO basically lost its primary reason to exist, because it was supposed to be a counterbalance to the Soviet Union and especially to the Warsaw Pact, which was founded a couple of years after NATO. And the Warsaw Pact, of course, dissolved, right? And a lot of the former Warsaw Pact members actually then became NATO members. So, and in the 90s and 2000s, NATO was desperately looking for new reasons to be around, and these out-of-area missions, of which Yugoslavia was the first one, became a linchpin in the rationale for the organization itself. And just in order to put things into a little bit of perspective, the most conservative estimates of civilian casualties in these 3 months bombing campaign puts the civilian casualty rate at around 527 people who died. And I think Gloria or Cheryl accurately introduced that civilian deaths are, of course, not allowed. I mean, you are not allowed to target civilian infrastructure. You're not allowed to target civilians personnel even in times of war. If you do so, that's a war crime. And the Serbs, to this day, Mr. Vucic keeps talking about 2,000 to 2,500 civilian deaths, but this number is very much disputed. The most conservative you find is somewhere around 500, which means that in 3 months, roughly 175 civilians were killed by NATO in this bombing campaign. And of course, NATO calls this collateral damage. It's not intended. It's an unfortunate byproduct of war. It's not intended. NATO doesn't commit war crimes, is what NATO says. Around 175 per month, that's collateral damage. If we look at the Ukraine war in the last 3 years between February 2022 and April 2025, we have the official estimate by Statista based upon OHCHR figures of around 13,000 casualties in Ukraine. And around 80% of those casualties are in the Ukrainian-controlled part, so they were most likely killed by the military force of Russia. And the civilian death toll in Ukraine in the Ukrainian-controlled part then amounts to roughly 280 people killed per month. And this is just to put this a little bit into perspective, these types of warfare, especially when NATO and NATO countries argue that Russia is targeting civilians and, this is a genocidal war. Then I must say, the difference between 175 and 280 is, it's more, it's 50-60% more, but we are nowhere near anything outside of the range of what NATO itself described as, normal collateral damage. Which is horrible, and I find both of these horrible. I just want to say that the bombing of Yugoslavia was not just a casual affair. It was not just a gentleman's kind of approach toward international conflict. No, this was very heavy, and it was definitely on the scale and on the intensity with which also Russia is fighting the war in Ukraine. Compared to this, though, and I just must do that, if you compare to this the death toll in the Gaza genocide, and I think it's a genocide, and I don't think history will remember this in any other way. In Gaza, we are at a death toll of roughly 2,200 people per month. So we are at an order of magnitude higher. This just in order to put, the carnage of war and the carnage of mass violence into perspective. That's why I also don't think that, anyone who argues that Russia is trying to pull off a genocide, but argues that Israel is defending itself, I think needs to look at these numbers, because the numbers speak for themselves. I mean, in the terms of the slaughter that we see going on. And all of these need to be stopped. None of this should happen. It's just the order of magnitude is definitely much higher when it comes to Gaza than what we saw with these, military interventions in Russia in Ukraine and NATO in Yugoslavia. So this is my the main point I wanted to make about the illegality of NATO, that it is breaching its own treaty, and that it also, of course, is in breach of international law when it does these actions. And I didn't even touch upon NATO's interventions after 1999. NATO was in Afghanistan, and somebody needs to tell me in what way, shape, or form Afghanistan is part of the North Atlantic area. NATO bombed Libya, and there was a UN mandate. The UN actually asked NATO, please implement a no-fly zone in Libya in order to protect civilians. And NATO then immediately went on to bombing Libya, which was way beyond the mandate, way beyond. And until this day, NATO defends its actions by saying, but the United Nations asked us to do that. It's like, no. The United Nations told you to shoot down Libyan airplanes, fighters and bombers, in case they would go and target civilians. That was the mandate. Your mandate was not to go to Libya and bomb the place to smithereens and overthrow the government of Mr. Muammar Gaddafi, which is what happened. And it ended horrible for Libya. It ended horrible. I mean, still to this day, Libya the economy of Libya has been destroyed, and the social fabric of Libya has been destroyed. So these out-of-area missions are now still continuing and ongoing. And of course, the US and NATO now has a military base in Kosovo. you can see clearly how NATO is an instrument, in my view, for great power politics. But the defenders of NATO and people who still think that NATO is the only thing that stands between, a peaceful Europe and the destruction of the continent, those people will, of course, argue that no, all of this is necessary in order to scare off adversaries, and NATO is a force for good. NATO is a force for protection. I just think that the historical record speaks against this. Now, to the second part, how neutrality is a better option, and this is the core of my research. I would like to start with the way that I understand neutrality, or that I recommend understanding neutrality, because there's different ways of thinking about it. We can either discuss officially neutral countries, countries with either in the constitution or in their legal codes with a clause that says we are permanently neutral, that are internationally also recognized, like Switzerland, Austria, Ireland have such clauses, but also Moldova has one of these. Costa Rica is an officially neutral country even without an army. Switzerland, Austria, and so on, the others with army. And there are different types of neutrals. Turkmenistan is one of the countries that says, I will be permanently neutral, right? So we could talk about these countries and about their policies. We could also talk about international law and how, for instance, in the Hague Conventions, neutrality is defined and what the rules and regulations for neutrals are, because just as we have international humanitarian law, which is the war of law. It's the war in law. It's the law in war, the law that regulates that you are not allowed to attack civilians, or that you're not allowed to attack soldiers who already gave up and wave a white flag. That's international humanitarian law. And in parallel, we have something called the law of neutrality, which is the law that regulates what neutral states can and cannot do in relations to belligerents when war exists, or what belligerents can do with neutrals when war is the case. And this type of law is also very well developed and actually rather large. So we could talk about that, but I recommend not trying to be too legalistic or too formalistic, and understand neutrality instead as a natural reaction of third parties toward conflict. So one of my main claims is that neutrality is anywhere and everywhere a reaction to conflict in one way or another. What do I mean with that? Let me explain this. And this is what I call the logic of neutrality, or a relational understanding of what neutrality means. And often, so in international relations, I recommend looking at the bilateral relations of states that they have, because any state in the world tends to have a relationship with everybody else. And sometimes they come together to form a collective for certain purposes, just like NATO, in multilateral treaties and so on at the United Nations. But fundamentally, the international world works on bilateral relations. And now, sometimes it happens that these relations are in conflict, and wars are, of course, the worst form of conflict when actual military violence is used. One of the problems of neutrals, and here I just introduced this picture, right? B1 is belligerent 1, B2 is belligerent 2, and they are at a war with each other, right? And then it often happens that we imagine the neutral as sitting in between B1 and B2, and being pulled, sometimes to the left, sometimes to the right, and sitting on the fence, all of these euphemisms or expressions that we have in order to describe a neutral party. But I recommend imagining neutrality differently, because the idea that neutrals stand in the middle obfuscates one of the most crucial aspects, which is that the neutral itself has a relationship with each of the belligerents, while the belligerents also have a relationship with each other. And neutrality emerges out of a triangular relationship. And it's essential to keep in mind that neutrals maintain a peaceful relationship with both belligerents. They confront the problem that they are friends with enemies. They are friends with those who are enemies to each other. And that then leads to a lot of the pulling left and pulling right and putting pressure on neutrals. The neutrality of neutral states, be it Switzerland, be it Austria, but also at the moment, it could be, you know, Ghana. Ghana's relationship with Ukraine and Russia is one of neutrality toward the conflict, right? Neutral parties are neutral toward a conflict. They're not neutral toward the belligerents. With the belligerents, they just have a normal relationship. They tend to try to have a normal trade relationship, normal security relationship, a normal, you know, people-to-people relationship with exchanges and visas and so on going, continuing, even while these states are at war with each other, right? And if we understand neutrality as a phenomenon emerging out of the way that states are connected with each other, we also see that the neutrals themselves are embedded in what I call a conflict constellation. Because while they remain neutral toward the conflict itself, the conflict still impacts them in some way. Usually what happens is that B1 and B2 will both tell the neutral party A, hey, I'm happy to be friends with you, but how the hell come you still trade with my enemy? And then states tend to do things like a Trading with the Enemy Act and say like, hey, you are in breach of my laws if you still have a good relationship with the other one. And then the neutral party usually says, dear B2, I understand your concern, but your enemy is not my enemy. And you can see this playing out at the moment beautifully, because usually the belligerents don't understand that. I mean, if you read US media, Western media in general, there's often this question mark. How is it possible that India still buys oil from Russia in breach of sanctions? It's like, yeah, those are your sanctions, not Indian sanctions. And the Indians, time and again for 3 years, their foreign minister, Jay Shankar, has said time and again, look, we are doing policies that are good for us, good for India. We have a good relationship with Russia, good relationship with Ukraine, and a good relationship with the US and the West in general. We want to maintain a good relationship with everybody, and we do what's good for India. We are not taking sides. We are not agreeing to your proposal that we have to be either on the one side or the other. We are not. We deal with everybody, and that's the most natural thing actually to happen in international relations for third parties, for third states. We can talk more about this later. Please ignore this one. This is not that important. So the one who defined neutrality best, in my view, is Thucydides, historian 2,500 years ago, who chronicled the wars in Greece, and he once said, you know, neutrality, or states that remain outside of warfare, try to be friends to all and foe to neither, foe to nobody, right? You remain friends with those who are at war with each other. Friends to all and foe to neither. And this is the most natural thing to happen. In Twitter terms, it would be #NotMyWar. Belligerents usually don't understand that position, because they always frame their military actions as good and morally justified, and sometimes even morally necessary, and not supporting them is the same as supporting evil, and therefore neutrals are evil, because, you know, that's usually how the rationale goes. If you're not on my side, you're on the side of evil, especially in the Judeo-Christian traditions. I'll skip this so that we can move faster toward our discussion. In how now this kind of neutrality, be it just the neutrality of India, or be it the formal neutralities of Switzerland and others, can help conflict in general, is through a couple of mechanisms, social mechanisms in the international world. First of all, it creates buffer zones, and I just urge you to think of the Cold War situation, in which we did have two hostile military alliances. We had NATO countries on the one hand, the blue ones here. We had the Warsaw Pact countries on the other side, the red ones here. But we also had a very large cordon sanitaire of neutral states, ranging from Finland and Sweden all the way down to, well, Switzerland, Austria, and Yugoslavia. The one place, there were a few places where these two alliances had hard contact lines, and the most dangerous one, without doubt, was the inner German border between East Germany and West Germany, right? And especially the tiny little city of of Berlin, which was also subdivided and had a West German part to it. This was extremely dangerous for any kind of, military also misunderstanding then to happen and to actually drag others into war. There was a proposal to make Germany neutral, but that proposal in the end basically failed because of Mr. Adenauer, the then Chancellor of Germany, of West Germany, who said like, no, this is a ploy. This is a ploy by the Soviets. The Soviets will never be serious about neutrality. Well, a year later, the Soviets accepted that Austria can become neutral. The Soviets withdrew. The Austrians declared their neutrality, and Austria actually remained part of the economic West, but security-wise, it remained a neutral. So I think Austria is a wonderful counterexample of no. The Soviets were serious about neutrality proposals at times, and these buffer zones, they did help, because in these zones in Finland, but also around Yugoslavia and Austria, we never had serious confrontations and clashes of these two blocks. So the buffer zone and buffer function is a very important one, which helps to de-escalate international tensions. It doesn't work always, but it is definitely one that has great potential to keep these warring parties away from each other. And if we look at also the Ukraine conflict, and maybe we can discuss that later, the neutrality of Ukraine is actually to the state, something that the Russians demand in order to end the war, and that they demanded in order to remain at peace back in 2022. Whether that's right or not is another question. But this idea of neutrals as buffer states is not just something that academics make up. This is also something that's at the heart of a lot of political thinkers in these countries, in great powers actually. So the refusal to do collective self-defense by neutrals say like, no, we will not defend ourselves collectively, we will defend ourselves alone, is a form of state pacifism. You don't need to promise, like Costa Rica, that you don't have an army. You don't need to be completely pacifist. But you can have a pacifist stance in the international arena by saying like, look, we will never join other states in their warfare. And thereby you basically make sure that your military is only meant for your own domestic purposes. And, a country like Switzerland, for instance, has a policy which says we will use weapons only inside our country. We will not fire beyond the border of Switzerland. Only if somebody crosses our border, we will fire at them. And this is, of course, to me, a much higher threshold of maintaining the peace than the idea of collective self-defense and sometimes collective self-defense abroad, right? In Yugoslavia, we need to bomb Yugoslavia in order to defend whatever it is that NATO makes up that currently needs defense. So in a sense, neutrality goes further than the UN Charter, because the UN Charter allows for collective self-defense. Neutral states say like, no, we reject collective self-defense, we do individual self-defense. It also makes sure that neutral countries who properly maintain their neutrality will always be available mediators in these in times of war of others, and can be used. And there's a lot of examples for neutrals actually doing mediation and good office services to belligerents in order to reduce the carnage of warfare and in order to ameliorate certain situations. It also stops alliance escalation. The First World War is a wonderful example of how interlocking alliance systems dragged in one participant after another, because these alliances started kicking in once warfare broke out in a very obscure little part of Europe, right? The First World War broke out in Sarajevo, in Bosnia Herzegovina, about the assassination of a crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then the dispute between Austro-Hungarians and the Serbs in the end led to a wildfire of states being dragged into war, because all of these alliance systems were around. So neutral spaces and neutral places break that logic. Sometimes neutrals get attacked, that is true, but if they are not in alliances, then at least the war doesn't spread. Just think for a second, the qualitative difference also in having a war an attack on Ukraine or attack on Poland. And so attack on Poland would trigger Article 5, and we would probably have a much larger war. At the moment, of course, by NATO, this is used as an argument to say Ukraine needs to be in NATO to be protected. The argument goes both ways. If it was, the war would be a world war already. So in a sense, Ukraine not being inside NATO actually, I think, spares us a world war. You can use this argument both ways. This is not a very clever argument to make if you want to, if we want to disarm pro-NATO voices. I just want to add this here to our general discussion. But the alliance escalation is something that won't happen with neutral states. And in the end, this diffuses the security dilemma. And the security dilemma, I hope you know, is this idea, you know, that in order for me to be secure, I will produce more weapons or increase my alliances. Thereby I look more threatening. I do deterrence. And the other side will automatically think that, oh, that guy is trying to threaten me, so I need to increase my weapons and my alliance in order to deter them. And then this one will think again, oh no, the other one is escalating, so I need to up my game, and then this one ups their game, right? And you end up in an escalation spiral, and you militarize yourself to death, right? These two parties. Because there's always an action-reaction going on in international relations. Usually we look at the security dilemma as pertaining only to weapons, but alliances do exactly the same thing, right? You add more members to your alliance, you look more threatening. So the other one will naturally do something similar, and that's exactly what we've seen in the Cold War. You know, NATO was formed in '49 in order to scare off the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union a few years later founded the Warsaw Pact in order to, you know, gather its forces and look more threatening to the other one. So this is this typical kind of mutual escalation. And neutrality, especially the neutrality of smaller and more states, diffuses this again, because you do not play into this deterrence game. Neutrals, even the ones with armies, they don't try to deter by being super mighty. They try to deter by being reasonably defensive, you know, by saying like, okay, if you want to come here, you can try, but we will fight. So you will have to pay a price in blood. You cannot have us for free, but we will not try to scare you to death, to do this NATO deterrence kind of a big stick approach. Neutral places do small stick and small carrot. The small carrot, of course, being that if you don't come here, if you don't invade, I will still have trade with you, and I will give you a lot of the things that you want, just not everything. You can just not have everything, but you can have a lot. But if you come, you will bleed, okay? So that's the kind of military rationale that especially our neutrals work with. That's what I wanted to tell you. You will find more information on my homepage, neutralitystudies.com, or on my YouTube channel at Neutrality Studies, on YouTube, where I usually interview people, but I also do some analysis, and I am looking forward to discussing with you.
Well, I'd like to thank our speaker for a wonderful explication of all these points from the NATO Charter and other aspects of the pros and cons of being a neutral state or having a block of neutral states. So I'm sure many people here will have something they want to contribute at this point. And I'll call on, who was it? I saw a hand there. I'm gonna have to get a better view of everyone here, gallery view.
Oh, I was just clapping if it was me.
Oh, okay. So we're ready. What do you think? Do you have any questions about why this may or may not be a good idea for ending some of this fighting we have going on right in Europe now? I think it's a terrible thing personally, and my question would be, how can we get some of the states in Europe to go neutral, like maybe some of the Eastern European ones? They're showing signs of it. Oh, Cheryl, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Oh no, Gloria, you had a question there. Which states would you want to go?
Well, I mean, there are ones who are breaking frequently. I don't like their internal politics, but they're starting to come together, and Romania just had an election that puts them at odds with the EU and some of their policies.
So, Pascal, what do you think about countries like Hungary?
I mean, yeah, what we are currently seeing in Europe, is actually a diminishing of neutrality, actually. I mean, on the one hand, we lost Finland and Sweden. They joined NATO. On the other hand, Switzerland, Austria, Ireland, while they maintain military neutrality toward the conflict, so they don't send weapons, they all joined the EU sanctions, so the economic warfare they joined, and others don't, of course, right? Like most states outside of Europe and North America do not join these sanctions. South America, Africa, Asia do not join sanctions. They maintain, in this sense, a proper kind of neutrality. But the formerly neutral states of Europe, all of them have now joined the rationale on the Western side. So actually, what we are seeing is a decline of neutrality in Europe, but we see a strengthening of this kind of neutral principles abroad or like outside of Europe. The states I would want to go neutral, yeah. I mean, these borderlands would be good. I mean, Ukraine itself, to me, is such a huge tragedy because for the research community, it has been clear for 10 years or more that this place must remain neutral. And, Ukraine had a neutrality clause on its constitution between 1995 and 2014. What then happened in 2014 is that the democratically elected leader, Mr. Yanukovych, the president, was ousted from government through these protests, which we by now know were heavily supported by Western governments, and the government that came in immediately said that they want to work toward joining NATO. Then Russia invades and annexes Crimea, and then the Ukrainian parliament cuts out the neutrality clause in the constitution and replaces it with a NATO clause saying like the goal of Ukraine is to join NATO. And we've only had a getting worse of the conflict from there. It only got worse and worse and worse, and now we have a huge war. And having having Ukraine as a neutral, and also others like Moldova is also borders Russia, being neutral, is the most logical thing in order to diffuse this security tension, right? But that's a policy that was officially not only not taken, but was actively worked against by certain political forces inside NATO, most infamously by the UK, which even in March, April 2022, when Ukraine and Russia were negotiating, and the neutrality of Ukraine was a key pillar of the documents that we know now that came out of these negotiations, when that was undermined by the UK government, which actually told together with the US government at the time, told Ukraine, you should fight. Just fight. We'll give you the weapons. You will win. You will get everything back. You don't need this. And that agreement, that neutrality agreement, which would have diffused this situation, then never became a reality. So in a sense, what we need to do is to study why neutrality fails to emerge as a solution. But when it does, it can help. And at the moment, I don't think it is realistic for Eastern European states to go neutral. I just don't think that will happen unless NATO collapses. And at the moment, I don't think we're there. But what happens when it does is a different question, because the only thing I can tell you with certainty as a historian is that everything ends. And NATO has been around for 75 years, and also NATO will end at some point. And what comes next, that's what we don't know. And working towards more neutrals in Europe might be a good idea, but we're still years away from that, I believe.
Can I ask, why was it that we understood Boris Johnson was the then Prime Minister, was the one who told Zelensky not to continue the peace talks? What was it in for the UK? Why was the UK took that approach? Do you know? Have you any? Can you explain that to us?
Well, that's something that we've been trying to figure out for the last 3 years. I mean, on the one hand, the UK is one of the countries with the strongest Russophobic attitudes. I mean, seeing Russia as a significant other that needs to be fought. And I do believe that at the time, the UK and the US were convinced, I mean, the administrations of both countries were convinced that Russia could be brought to its knees and that Russia wouldn't survive these large-scale sanctions and then the military support of Ukraine, so that this would be a military victory, you know, for on the battlefield. I would guess that was the main motivating factor.
I see with some questions in the chat, but I just wanted to, I've listened to quite a few talks about NATO and Ukraine and Russia war. And one of the experts that I heard said that Russia was actually more worried about Ukraine joining the EU than there was about it joining NATO, that it was actually more of an economic issue in Putin's mind. He wanted to be able to continue trading with Ukraine and getting, I suppose, their grain, their wheat and what have you. And he saw them moving towards joining the EU. Have you any comment on that thought?
I haven't heard that interpretation yet, and I would need to study it to understand the argument precisely, but I don't find that likely, because for several reasons. I mean, one is that when, you know, in 2014, when the whole thing or the mass violence started in Kiev and then later in the Donbass, the thing that kicked this off was that there was an association agreement on the table from the European Union toward the Ukrainians, saying like, okay, here's an association, well, the association agreement, which is not a membership agreement yet, but easier access to the EU market, which is something Ukraine was looking for. At the same time, they also had a similar agreement, a free trade light agreement with Russia that was offered to Ukraine. And the association agreement with the EU said no other such agreements with Russia allowed if you take this one. The Russian agreement said you are allowed to take whatever other agreements as well. They didn't care if Ukraine was also integrated with the European Union. At that time, later too, to my knowledge, the whole idea in this neutrality, what the Russians proposed in December 2021, and then later during the negotiations in March and April, was no military association with any bloc. To my knowledge, that did not include the like preventing Ukraine from joining or at least being affiliated with the European Union. In my view, the Russians even signaled that they would agree to the EU, because the EU at its core is not a defense alliance. It's an economic, it's a club for economic exchange in various ways. And in a sense, you know, Russia would benefit of that largely, because it would be a direct bridge. You know, if you have a bridge into the Ukrainian market and the Ukrainian market has a bridge into the EU, then well, you have a lot of economic potential that could flourish from there. So for these reasons, I would think, no, it is NATO membership, the security aspect, that is the main driving factor for the Russians to oppose West integration of Ukraine.
So, go ahead.
You see some
Yeah,
questions?
there's a question. Oh, I see only one that hasn't been answered. It comes from, oh gosh, well, I forget who it comes from, but anyway, they want to know if Switzerland is still neutral.
Yes and no. It depends on how you look at it. Switzerland still maintains military neutrality, and it keeps to the laws of the Hague Conventions, you know, no export of weapons. And Switzerland also did not give its consent to European states who use Swiss weapons to re-export those weapons to Ukraine. They said, no, this is not allowed. If you have weapons of ours, they cannot go to Ukraine, which is a standard thing, a standard clause the Swiss have in their, weapons trade agreements with third states. No Swiss weapons should go to active conflict zones. So in this sense, they maintain that policy. On the other hand, they do support all of the sanctions, and they joined all the EU sanctions. And the Russians are saying, you are not neutral anymore. You are an unfriendly state. So if you interpret neutrality as having to include economic neutrality, then No, it is not anymore. But the strict rules of neutrality law do not cover that. There is no provisions in the Hague Conventions that say you need to maintain military neutrality. This is a kind of a political decision, and it is on a political level for you to decide on whether or not you want to count that as being part of the conflict. So if we just think of the conflict as playing out on two levels, military level and economic level, Switzerland not neutral anymore, military level still neutral, and that's going on at the same time. So that's why yes and no.
I see another question in the chat, and it comes from Dolores Howard. And what can be the role of neutral states in the genocide in Gaza?
Well, the most important contribution would be to not send weapons to Israel. You know, I had this discussion before with colleagues from Australia who said, "Bah, if you declare neutrality, then you wouldn't be able to put sanctions or pressure on Israel, right?" And that is true to a certain extent. But the main issue of Gaza is that the Western world, the United States and Europe, first and foremost in Europe, Germany, sent incredible amounts of weapons to Israel, which Israel then unloaded over Gaza. So had that not happened, had these states all maintained neutrality and said like, no weapons trade with you, Israel, while there's warfare going on, again, the neutrality could have taken away part of the oxygen, you know, that conflicts need in order to grow. Conflicts grow because states join them, and conflicts grow because states support the implements of war. So if you have more neutrals that then take away these implements of war, maybe the war itself wouldn't go away, but it would definitely remain smaller. And there is, to my mind, no way in which Israel could have unleashed the carnage it did in Gaza had it not had access to all of these Western weaponry. That's not to say that they couldn't have done anything. They have their local productions, but it wouldn't have been enough to create what they did here. And in this sense, it would have changed the entire also political development of what we are seeing, you know, of this back and forth between also Israel and Hamas. Let's not forget, like there's still negotiations also going on. While there is, in my view, a genocide happening, at the same time, we also have Hamas that still maintains a certain level of ability also to hold on to hostages and so on, right? And Israel holds on to its hostages on its side. But the whole dynamic of that conflict would have been dramatically changed.
And thank you. And now we have one from Dragana Zvancevic, who asked if Professor Lottaz can comment more on NATO's ongoing expansion into Latin America and Asia Pacific. NATO did shelf its office in Tokyo and I think in Vilnius.
Yes, I mean, we're seeing an expansionist strategy of NATO ever since the 1990s. Ever since the first round of expansion, and these expansions are going on, and the idea now is to make NATO relevant in the Pacific. And this is actually where we are for the first time seeing internal disagreements. There is a number of NATO states from Europe who are saying like we should not be in the Pacific, especially like states like Hungary and so on, that want to maintain NATO but want to keep it thoroughly focused on Europe. Now, there's others who have ambivalent relationship with this, especially like the Germans and also the French, who partially agree, partially disagree. But this is about where we see the limits now of what can be done. I mean, it's utterly unrealistic to expect at any time, let's say, Japan could join NATO. That's just utterly out of the question. Not just because of the charter, but also because it just would make no sense to anyone at the moment, right? But it is the strategy of on an operational level to create more interconnections between these militaries is going on, and I do think on the one hand it's dangerous, on the other hand it's a process that's extremely difficult. Military interoperability is hard, and especially when states also like Japan and others try to maintain their own weapon systems and their own military protocols, harmonizing those is a very long process. So I think what they're trying to do is just on the level of the possible have military to military connections, but I do not see this as yet a political drive, the way that definitely the expansion in Europe was a political drive in the 1990s.
Well, thank you. It was very informative, very dense information. I have a question that I'm going to put in for Robin Lloyd and some other, what's the other one? I think, well, I can't remember who, but one of our members said, when we discuss AFRICOM, it's not very well contextualized. And that's, I guess you're familiar with AFRICOM. It's the United States military, I don't know, units that are all over Africa. And how does that relate to NATO? And one of the members in the WILPF group said that we should always look at AFRICOM as being part of this bigger picture of NATO. So could you speak to that at all? She said
Yes.
it's not contextualizing it well.
So I don't know much about AFRICOM itself, other than that it is organized out of Germany, out of one of the US bases there, and therefore is part of, you know, not part of the NATO structure, but it is part of how the United States interacts with its NATO allies in Europe. But in general, to contextualize this, you know, NATO in this sense is but one of the building blocks of the United States overall military strategy, global military strategy. AFRICOM is another one, and the Pacific, the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific agreements that the United States has is a third one. In the military alliance with Japan, the military alliance with Korea, some researchers look at this as a hub and spokes system that radiate out of the United States and connected to these different places. All of the US military bases in the Middle East and in Africa are part of that. And those places are not part of NATO. On the contrary, kind of NATO is part of this hubs and spokes system through which, you know, the United States is also able to project a lot of force. And it is also important to know that not all of the interactions the United States has with its European allies go through NATO. So there is NATO as an organization, and NATO as a, you know, as a club that coordinates these military structures of the members, including the United States. But the US also has individual US bases in these NATO member states. Most recently, it opened 15 military bases in Sweden and 17 military bases in Finland, the newest members of NATO. And these military bases are not under NATO rule. They are not, this is not an agreement between Sweden and Finland and NATO as an organization. They are agreements with the United States. And the US now has a treaty with both of these countries to station forces, and this goes into high detail, you know, including that US military personnel does not have to pay taxes in these two countries, not even consumption tax. Any kind of coffee that the military personnel of the US drinks in Finland or Sweden, they can get the receipt and then they send it in, and then the Swedish government will reimburse them on the 10 or 20% of consumption tax. That's the level of detail to which this goes. And those are US you know, bilateral relations. And NATO in this sense, and AFRICOM in another, are additional organizational structures, organizational legs, which the US can use in order to foster these relationships. But so not everything is channeled through NATO, right? On the contrary, NATO is rather a way to channel certain bilateral and multilateral agreements with the Europeans.
Oh, that's interesting. I had sort of misunderstood. I thought everything went through NATO. I see Cheryl has her hand up.
So why did the US wait until now to put these US bases in Finland and Sweden?
Because Finland and Sweden,
it looks like it's connected with NATO, but you're saying it isn't actually. So why didn't they put bases in 20 years ago?
Because Finland and Sweden didn't agree 20 years ago. 20 years ago, Finland and Sweden said, no, we're neutral, therefore no bases on our territory. In 2022, they said, we are shedding neutrality, we are now joining NATO. And in that process, they said, the United States said, oh, how about bases? And they said, like, great idea, let's have bases, that will make us more secure. So it's a political decision. So it doesn't come automatically with NATO, but the decision to join NATO changed what is politically possible inside these countries.
Okay, so they became not neutral when they joined NATO.
Yes, I mean, I haven't met a researcher who argues that NATO membership is compatible with neutrality, although in theory you could try to make that argument, but I haven't met anyone who makes that. So if you become part of a military alliance, more or less by definition, you're outside of the scope of what still counts as neutral. Switzerland for a long time argued that membership in the United Nations is not compatible with neutrality, but it joined in 2002, and Austria, neutral Austria, that had a neutrality clause in its constitution, joined already in 1955. So there's levels of assessments of what kind of club membership is still compatible and what's not. And I have never met anyone who argued that club membership in NATO would be still squareable with NATO. Although I must say one thing, the thing is, it's not black and white, not at all. Finland became a member of NATO in 2022, and there are a couple of islands in front of Finland, actually between Finland and Sweden. They're called Åland Islands. The Åland Islands were officially neutralized, made neutral in 1921, 100 years ago, or 1924, 100 years ago. They were officially made neutral by treaty. They are part of Finland. There are Swedish speakers there, but part of Finland. Very geopolitically important islands for, if you use a navy. But the agreement in 1924 or 21 was that no army can go there. Neither the Swedish nor the Finnish army. No army can go there. So it was officially made a neutral part of Finland. And so for the longest time, we had a neutral part of neutral Finland, and now Finland is not neutral anymore, but this agreement is still valid. So in a sense, we now have a neutral island that is part of a larger NATO agreement. And I have read assessments that say, like, the Åland Islands and islanders, they still consider this as valid. And the NATO is not trying to put up a post in Åland Islands because that will create political unrest on the islands. So stuff is not black and white. And it can be quite complex, but usually the question is about what is politically feasible and whatnot.
I see. Yes, there's a remark an interesting remark about Australia in the chat. Can you see the chat, Pascal?
No, sorry.
Shall I
there is a remark there by Dragana Savancevic. Everyone, Showalter exercises in Australia come to my mind, where 19 countries will come together in late July and August. Something. I don't know. Look up Talisman Sabre.
I think Talisman Sabre is the name of the operation of the exercise. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a typical kind of thing that these military alliances do, right? They practice stuff again, because coordination between militaries is a difficult thing to do, even within NATO. And it's not I mean, these exercises are then often also used to project power and to threaten, to tell others like China and Russia and North Korea, look what we can do. We're so powerful. If you don't behave, then you'll get this. And that's just very unproductive for the purposes of peaceful development of international relations.
I also want to speak for someone who isn't here, Ulla Klotzer, who's from Finland, and she has been very animated on the subject of those bases in Finland and in Sweden. And she said, I think it was regarding the ones in Sweden, she challenged us. She said, do you know that Swedish soldiers cannot go into those bases in Sweden?
Swedish
she said it was like an occupation.
Yeah, I mean, read the treaty. There's treaties, Swedish, US treaty and Finnish US treaty. You can download them. they read horrible. They read like an occupation, like a surrender, like a treaty of surrender, like what Japan had to sign in 45 in order to for the war to stop, for the bombing to stop. Again, they don't even pay consumption tax. And also the United States has the right to transport any kind of weapon category there. Any kind that includes nuclear weapons. This is, a state which by treaty gives up its right on deciding whether or not foreign nuclear weapons will be stationed on its soil. That's just the height of irresponsibility. And this is, again, I mean, to me, this is very dramatic. And I don't think that the Germans have, no other NATO state has such harsh conditions, and why Sweden and Finland were willing to sign these papers is a mystery to me.
Yeah, it's like an occupation, according to Ulla, and she's very upset about it. But she says that the media doesn't allow any criticism at all of what's going on. So
the media just doesn't air it. I mean, it is allowed to criticize this. It's just not being aired. So it's like sad.
Didn't you have someone from, was it Finland or Sweden, one of the two recently, who was the Minister of Parliament? Manil or Manir, I can't think of his name, but it was something like that, who was very critical of the occupation. You know the one I'm talking about? He was on your show.
Thomas Malinen?
Yeah, Malinen from Finland. Yeah.
There are people who are very critical of this, but in general, the political establishments in both countries are overwhelmingly in favor of this. They view this as a security policy, that because you have these bases, nobody can attack their countries because the US would automatically be drawn into war. They look at it in this way. I don't think this is a wise way of looking at this. Sweden and Finland managed to be perfectly peaceful during the whole Cold War. So giving this up and replacing it with something that if a NATO war happens, if this becomes a reality, then Russia must fire at these bases. They must eradicate them, right? So you make yourself a target if things go wrong. It's like a security policy that only delivers security in normal conditions. And if you surpass a threshold, then everything will collapse. And you will necessarily become a target. And I don't think that's a wise policy.
Pretty scary. I see we have Diane Blaze hand up here. So Diane.
Yeah. So were there referendums or voting on these issues? And no. It was just
in Finland and Sweden, both of them. It was an act of parliament. They just decided this, and this was actually criticized. The Swedes and the Finns both said. I mean, a lot of people actually said, "Oh, we should have had a referendum on this," but no.
And the NATO leadership is how? I mean, there's no voting on that, or there. I mean,
there is. I mean, in order to join NATO, all member states need to agree. So at the time it was 30. Now it's 32, and they all had to agree. And there was actually Turkey. Turkey said no to Finnish membership because Turkey had to Swedish membership because Turkey had a separate dispute with Sweden about some Turkish exilees, and they wanted them repatriated to Turkey. I mean, extradited to Turkey because they wanted to put them in prison. And they said, unless you give us these people who are like talking badly about our government in Sweden, we will not agree to you becoming a NATO member. And sure enough, Sweden tried to do everything it could in order to extradite these people whom they had given a humanitarian asylum before. So there was a dispute, but in the end it was resolved, and both of them got the okay by Turkey to join.
I see Cheryl's hand up again.
I will ask a question, but then I see Vera has some comment.
I had two, and I didn't know which to mention.
So this question of the spiderweb operation, where Ukraine was able to smuggle its drones into Russia and attack some of the Russian planes, and did destroy maybe 8 or 9 of them. There's people discussing exactly how many Russian planes the Ukraine drones were able to. So one would have thought this was an act of war. right? One would have thought that Putin would have said, this is an act of war, and now you've gone over some red line, I'm going to come attack, start a real war with everybody else. But I understand the way his foreign minister characterized it was an act of terrorism.
Yeah.
And therefore, it wasn't an act of war. Therefore, Putin doesn't have to go full force into a even bigger war. Am I right? I mean, do you know why he did that? I mean, it saved the rest of us by him calling it an act of terrorism.
Yeah, I mean, act of terrorism is already an escalation from where we are at the moment in the Russian rhetoric, right? But one of the things we're seeing with this war in Ukraine, between Russia and Ukraine and NATO and Russia, is also this utter confusion of the terminologies, right? The whole point of international law was to create a precise terminology so that we know what kind of types of law then applies in what kind of situations. And what we have done over not just the last 3 years, but the last 80 years since the founding of the UN, is we've started to confuse or to weaken and mix up the terminology. So instead of calling the law of war, the law of war, the way it used to be called, we renamed it to international humanitarian law. And we are not calling stuff wars anymore. We call them international armed conflicts. And civil wars are called non-international armed conflicts. And we still apply the same rules and regulations to them, but we try to make legal distinctions between what's going on. And one of the things Russia did in 2022 is it didn't declare war. It declared a special military operation. And thereby triggered certain military protocols in Russia of what can and cannot be done. Because, officially states don't declare war anymore, even though we still understand that de facto war is going on, but it's not being declared. So in a sense, I wonder if under the Russian legal system, there even is still a instrument called the declaration of war. It might not exist because Russia, just like the United States and others, are trying to be in conformity with United Nations jargon and so on. So everybody speaks about defensive operations or collective self-defense, but not about war. So in a sense, then Russia saying escalating this to a anti-terror operation as opposed to just a special military operation is to me a logical next step. And again, I'm not even sure if the Russian legal codes even have a provision that would allow for a declaration of war, even though these acts are acts of war. But on the other hand, Russia firing weapons and having military personnel in Ukraine is also an act of war. So de facto, everybody understands there's a war going on. And I think the Russians are rational enough to deal with this situation.
I have an EU question from Vera Zalka, and she's saying she's not liking the way that the EU is set up. I think all European countries, without exception, should be members of a new form of European Union. Today's EU is colonialist, excluding, not fair trade basis cooperation. Do you see a possibility for Yankees to go home from Europe and all Europeans living in peace and mutual economic help and cooperation?
That would be my hope, and I completely agree with this assessment. The European Union is horribly broken, and I think it's broken beyond repair. Unfortunately, historically speaking, the Europeans have no good track record at living in peace with each other. This is just a sad fact of history. We manage to be at each other's throats every 10 or 15 years, in one place or another. But the hope would be that, yes, a new structure that could replace the EU would manage to have the same effect on the European continent and pacify everybody while not becoming an utter monster, the way that the UN is currently the EU is currently transforming into a administrative monster that actually is starting gave up its whole peace mandate and is now clearly a war project in order to channel funding into war.
So the EU too is a war project.
Yeah, the EU is a war project by now. I mean, external war. Like now they have like 800 billion euros of war chest that they want to make available to member states in order to gear up individually. This to me is an abomination and just the opposite of what the EU should stand for.
And
I mean,
the OSCE, which is, I forget what it stands for, but that is often looked at as something that could in the past have been a neutral negotiating instrument. But I understand they're dealing very closely with NATO. Is that correct?
The OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, is the outcome of the successor organization of the Conference of Security and Cooperation in Europe, which is the greatest peace success story of the Cold War. The conference was very difficult. It took 5 years between 1970 and 75, but in the end, it brought together over 30 states, including the Soviet Union, the United States, and everybody in between, in order to agree on a catalog of minimum requirements of how politics should be structured in the Euro-Atlantic area, including human rights. It was a huge success to achieve this. And the OSCE is the outcome organization that is supposed to follow up on this, but the OSCE has been largely sidelined and checkmate because it depends on the will of its member states to contribute, and as the Russians as well as the Americans and a couple of Europeans are just not willing anymore to deal with each other in that club. And in a sense, it's becoming incapacitated, and it has started working with NATO, but you know, the work with NATO, the OSCE mainly worked on operational issues of monitoring of conflicts. It was, for instance, the monitoring body in the Donbass that just recorded where does something explode between 2014 and 2022. It didn't even say who shot. It just said, like, here something exploded, there something exploded, because you can say that with certainty without attributing guilt and blame. And it did that wonderfully, and it was in this sense a well-functioning kind of neutral organization. But again, it has been checkmated. I would hope that it regains its strength, but at the moment, I don't have a lot of political hope for that.
Well, I see we're approaching 90 minutes, I guess. So is there one more comment or question?
And I will have to leave in a few minutes, actually.
Right. Well, I would just like to say, as you can't see the chat, Professor, that a lot of complimentary remarks, very
thank you very much.
informative. People have had to leave, but they've really enjoyed it. I certainly have enjoyed it. I've taken my own notes, as I always do, understanding why the articles of the incorporation of NATO. Could somebody actually go back and change those? Is there a process for saying, oh, well, we want to change our charter?
Usually the way you do that is you would need the agreement of all of them. I'm pretty sure there's probably an article in the charter that says how to change the charter. And probably it's like by unanimous support. I'm not entirely sure, but there must be. There usually is an agreement of how to do this. But that's the thing. They didn't change the charter. They went out of area, but they didn't change the charter. They could have changed the charter, but they didn't, which just also tells you that they know that if you had to do this, you know, officially, and you had to debate this, then probably you wouldn't get agreement. So you do it operationally, basically against your own founding statutes, which is just sneaky.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. And
we're very pleased. I think people got a lot from this.
I'm glad you enjoyed it, and I'll be happy to be in touch with you also in the future. Best of luck. I mean, your organization since 1915, and now more needed than ever again. So keep up the good work.